But really how this came together was more, so for example, my uncle, he worked in corrections. He was there for a long time. He transitioned to public safety work for an agency, and he developed bipolar disorder. And he correlates everything back to what he saw in corrections.
You are a warrior.
321 status.
What kind of vehicle is it?
You are the very best your nation has to offer.
911.
Multiple shots fired.
They're asking you to lead.
5. We need a Bearcat.
It's up to us.
So 133. I need somebody that's got a visual on where the shooter is.
You must be sound in mind, body, and spirit.
42, where's the officer down? I have a rescue helicopter that wants to land and help.
This is the podcast that will make you the one.
Copy running eastbound.
The one that will bring everyone back.
Trouble, we have shots fired. Give me backup now.
Because no one else is coming.
We're going to have an officer shot. 100 block of East Street.
Suspect is down.
This is The Squad Room.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Squad Room Podcast, where we learn how to serve, strive, and succeed in our challenging careers as first responders. On this show, we cover the tactics and strategies you can use to lead with vision, honor your oath, and take care of your mind and your body, and be the one in someone else's time of need. My name is Garrett Teslaw, and I'm a full-time sergeant for a sheriff's office in Southern California, and I'm on a mission to build a world where first responders wake up inspired, feel confident at work, and go home safe, knowing they've spent their time in a worthy cause. Before we get to our guest, I want to remind you of a few things. First, if you're on social media, make sure you're following us at the Squad Room. There's content we put out on social media that's exclusive to social media, videos and stuff in the Instagram feed or on the Facebook group. Join our Facebook group. Lots of great interaction there going on with people asking questions and engaging and sharing ideas. And of course, like our Facebook page as well to stay updated on episodes. But most importantly, if there's one thing you need to do, it's you need to go over to thesquadroom.net and sign up for our Tactical Tuesdays email list. We've had a great response, amazing feedback on this, and it's only been going for a bit now, but every Tuesday I send you out 3 to 5 tips, tactics, strategies, something I think you will find useful to help you get through the week. Might be a book I want to share, some gear I found useful, an inspiring quote, or just anything I think that would help you get through the day. Sometimes it's a training video that you can use for briefing trainings. Whatever it is. Go to thesquadroom.net/Tactical Tuesdays and sign up for the list. You can also text your name and email address to 805-364-2331. Again, 805-364-2331 to get signed up for the list. If you didn't catch that, just check out the phone number in the show notes. You can grab it there. And it's great. We're having a lot of fun with it, and we're getting a great response. All right. My guest today is Bruce Valles. Bruce is the founder and CEO of Mindbase. And Bruce is not a cop. And I wasn't even sure about how or doing an episode about technology and law enforcement, if that would really work, or if it was like on point with quote unquote the brand of the Squad Room, But Bruce reached out over social media and let me know about his company. And I was intrigued, super intrigued. And we talked so we got on a phone call because I just wanted to learn more. And we talked for like an hour and a half. And I asked all sorts of questions and he had a really well thought out answer. And so our talk today is not a commercial for his company, Mindbase. They don't sponsor the show. I don't have any vested interest in anything they do. I just think he's got a unique perspective about how technology is starting to integrate into officer wellness, how agencies have options now about taking this stuff seriously enough to integrate into CAD and to provide their employees with options outside of just EAP or outside of, even worse yet, just sweeping it under the rug. And it's incredibly cool or motivating to see that there's a lot of agencies picking up a product like Mindbase or its competitors and integrating it. What's disheartening and crushing, and Bruce shares this in the episode, and I'm going to leave it for you to find it yourself, is that there are still agencies, huge agencies, He told me who the agency was off the record that he talks about in this episode. Huge agency, major problems at this agency, constantly in the news, constantly having officer suicides. And they are intentionally shoving their head in the sand because it's cheaper for them to deny knowledge of it than it is to accept it and to deal with the rash of officer mental health issues that they're dealing with at this agency. It'll blow your mind. I can't tell you who it is. I really want to. Would love to throw them under the bus, but I told Bruce I wouldn't. So you can learn more about his company Mindbase. They're based up in Seattle. No problems there, right? They're based up in Seattle. You can find more at getmindbase.com. Again, we talk about this sort of through the lens of what his company does, but it's really a conversation about how technology is coming on board and catching up, like how consumer technology is catching up in the law enforcement area, how in the first responder professions to help us on a macro level. So please enjoy this episode with Bruce Valles.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's so much these days of how maybe it's because of COVID. Maybe it's because I'm getting older and I'm out less. Probably just a lot of it's COVID. But we met, just like I've met so many people recently online.
Yeah.
Through
Right.
one of the social networks, right? We got connected and started a conversation online that we eventually took to a actual like real conversation. And I thought my audience would enjoy hearing from you because when we talked, I wasn't quite sure about this idea that you have, but we talked for like 90 minutes that day or something close to that, and we just chatted and
Right.
chatted. And you really helped me open my eyes to what you're doing, and I was really excited by it. And so I want to give you a chance to tell that story and what you're doing with Mindbase. And I also want to tell people, like, first of all, like, we're going to talk about a lot of topics about integrating technology with uh, officer wellness and care and how we do that and some of the challenges. That's why I have you here. You're not a sponsor of the episode. You're not paying to be here. We don't have any relationship other than I just think you are really bringing a lot of value to our profession and really inspired by it. And I'm particularly inspired by the fact that you have really no law enforcement background, but you saw a need in our service. So let's start there. Tell us about Mindbase and then why, or rather how you got to that day where you decided to plant your flag with this idea.
Yeah, great. No, and I appreciate you kind of sharing that. We had a great conversation. I love so I came across you on LinkedIn, and I think you actually posted about one of your podcast episodes, and I took a listen to it. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. So, and then I reached out to you and I was like, hey, I'd love to be on the show. I'd love to kind of share what we're about, what we're doing, kind of some of the things that we're finding. And I think that might be very, very interesting to your audience. So, if anything, glad we connected, glad we came together. I think you're right. This is a new normal, right? It's a non-traditional way of getting in touch with folks. And it kind of forced us to that, right? Like a year or two ago, we probably wouldn't have connected through LinkedIn. We probably would have met like a trade show or just through passing or through some colleagues. But no, it's great. To give you some overview of Mindbase and who we are. So Mindbase is essentially an impact startup. We're based in Seattle. We're a small team, small agile team. We're building what we call a detection and intervention platform. So we've realized that those are two of the biggest gaps within public safety. I'm sure most folks who are in the space know that it's not very easy or good to navigate support, right? If you're experiencing any sort of trauma or any sort of challenges, it's very, very difficult to get help. And for a lot of different reasons, right? Stigma is one of them that we're all familiar with, but again, it's just the experience isn't very good, right? You have to go through like an EAP system, which is kind of clunky. It just gives you benefit information. Maybe you might have resources like psych services or things like that if your department's contracted with that, or you just might have a brochure or a 1-800 number to call. Again, very, very static resources. So again, it's not very easy or good to get help. Um, Again, there's a level of confidentiality that isn't very good to navigate either. So we're doing a couple different things in that space, and what we're trying to do specifically is kind of eliminate a lot of those barriers and all those friction points. So what we do at a high level is Mindbase is an app for public safety agencies. We provide things like mindfulness, meditation, guided CBT. There's also a wide variety of different resources within our app. You can also access ways to speak with like clinicians. So we've partnered with a company called ZocDoc, which is one of the largest providers of clinicians within the country. So if you're able to schedule coordinated and ongoing care for things like substance abuse or anxiety or depression, all without the department or agency knowing. So this is all confidential. We don't actually track any of that data, and
Mhm.
we don't. There's no analytics or behaviors or activity that we're capturing there. So everything that you do is completely anonymized within our app. So we wanted to be able to provide that because again, we felt like that was the biggest barrier to entry for anyone trying to seek support, right?
Oh yeah,
So
for sure.
the other interesting piece that we're doing is we actually integrate into the agency's CAD and RMS system. So again, we're really focused on being a detection and intervention platform. So we're saying, hey, how can we identify when to get folks the help when they need it most? So for example, let's say you're an officer and you're dispatched out to a rollover car accident, right? And there's an infant death. Our system will know that you were sent out to a critical call, and it will shoot you a push notification and with something along the lines of saying, "Hey, that last call might have been tough. Here's some resources that can help with what you might be experiencing." And then it'll start suggesting things like guided meditation, CBT. It'll start recommending modules for stress and anxiety or depression, depending on what you saw. So it captures all of that exposure data through your CAD system, and then it recommends resources based off of that. So it's completely personalized to what you're going through and what you're experiencing. And the other piece is the dashboard. So the dashboard is extremely powerful for administrative folks, leadership to really identify what's going on within their workforce. Part of that is, I'm sure you guys know, first line of support is identifying there's a problem and identifying there's a need. And interestingly enough, the only approach public safety is taking is reactive. So we're more on the proactive side. Peer support agency and leadership's more so saying, hey, I just want to know when my officer has a rise in excessive force or complaints or things along those lines, because then I know something's wrong, right? And I need to talk to them. We're more saying, hey, we know these guys see a lot of events that build up over time, these micro traumas that really break down that emotional reserve that lead to these points, right? So if anything, we're capturing a lot of that up front. And we're trying to, again, be the leader in detection and intervention that helps you just because again, mental health is not something you solve, right? It's not something we're not ever claiming that we're going to get rid of this problem. There's always going to be another critical call. There's always going to be another critical incident. It's how you manage and maintain that, and then build that resiliency over time so you can bounce back, right?
And so there's so much to dig into there, and so many questions about confidentiality, and that the idea of a dashboard is intriguing, but I'm sure for most line officers also terrifying. but one of the things that brings up in that conversation, and as I'm thinking about as you're talking, you're in the tech space. um Tech is obviously the place to be these days if you're looking to be an entrepreneur.
Right,
but government contracting work is typically not like the gold mine. Like they didn't build Twitter or Facebook for the government, because the government never has any money. Right?
right.
Nobody in government has any money. Nobody's got a budget. I mean, I hear that all the time. But it's compelling that you entered this space for the reasons that you did, and I was hoping you could share that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so. Government definitely is not the sexy space, right? When you start doing tech, you really want to build something that's either like customer facing or that's like consumer facing or B2B, at the enterprise level is really attractive because again larger order volumes, and things like that. So we're definitely operating in a really unique space, right? I think
Mhm.
if you look at if you look at the private sector, employee wellness and well-being has been around for decades, right? This is technology that's it's really common. A lot of organizations put a huge emphasis, a lot of resources dedicated to this. But again, the public sector, public safety specifically, largely underserved, right? That
Mhm.
experience is really, really bad. There's a lot of gaps in the area, and these gaps are really affecting lives, right? If I work at Amazon and my employee is burnt out and he doesn't do his job, like that doesn't really matter. I mean, it does per se, but again, if that from an officer perspective, um, these are lives that we're affecting, right? So
Right.
there's a big difference, right? So um, if anything, we just wanted to fill that gap. and then again try to come at it from a unique approach, because again, officer wellness has been a focus area for a long time within public safety, but no one's really mastered that. But again, we want to take a really, really unique approach to that, and I think that's what we're trying to do within the CAD and RMS integration. But really, how this came together was more so. For example, my uncle, he worked in corrections. He was there for a long time. He transitioned to public safety work for an agency, and he over his course of his career, I think 27 years total, he developed bipolar disorder. And he correlates everything back to what he saw in corrections. So, sure, corrections is a completely different animal than patrol,
Mm-hmm.
and what he was seeing there. So, what I realized is my uncle wasn't an outlier. He wasn't anything. He wasn't a pioneer. This was really happening across the board, right? This was just another story, another statistic. The more and more I started looking at at what was going on with him personally, and it really affected his entire life. He was forced into early retirement. He felt that he had about 10 years left within the agency. Once he was diagnosed, he was demoted. He was reassigned, and personally, he ended up getting divorced from my aunt, and changing his whole life there. So not only was he not able to do the job that he wanted, he no longer was married to my wife or to his to my aunt, his wife, and so it completely changed his life. And what I realized is when you start looking at the data, that's really the story that we see, but everyone's kind of avoiding it, right? So, for example, if you look at the statistics for this year alone, we're at 35 officers that have committed suicide, right, since January 1st, 2020. If you look at the last 3 years in a row, it's outweighed line of duty deaths. It's been triple digit numbers for over a decade, right? The data
Mm-hmm.
is telling us a really unique story. It's telling us that public safety is failing the most vulnerable, and that there's big gaps, right? So for us, we're trying to solve that through detection and intervention. We're trying to identify when there's a problem, when there's a need, and provide resources when they need it most. So at a high level, that's really what Mindbase is about. We're really on a mission to solve that, because I don't think anyone's done that well. And again, we're really, really fortunate to be playing a super small role in the wellness and resiliency strategies for agencies.
So I really think it's, to me, what was compelling about it was that you have this, your uncle who you saw and had a firsthand experience of some of the detrimental effects of unaddressed trauma and mental health, and how that can, interact with your career and your life, of course. And that's really intriguing to me. What has been so just to kind of give people a real clear picture, this is an app for agencies, correct? I mean, an individual officer. This is meant to be agency wide, correct?
It is, yeah. So there's a couple different components to it, and again, I'll highlight that really quick. So one of the components is it's an administrative dashboard for leadership. They're the ones that can see what's going on. So, for example, it will pull CAD data, incident data for their entire workforce. So they'll be able to see that holistically. So whether or not folks are using the app, since we're integrating into the CAD system, we'll still get a view of everybody, right? And
Mhm.
that's one of the biggest value adds to Mindbase is, again, nobody falls through the cracks. So, for example, I met with the Seattle Police Department a couple weeks ago. Um, and they're about 1,400 folks strong. And their peer support team is about 3 to 4 people. There's no
Mhm.
way they can connect with everybody, right?
That's
It
tiny.
becomes, it is, and it becomes more guesswork and routine work, right? They just say,
Mhm.
hey, I know it's been 2.5 months since I've talked to Steven Jackson. I know I need to connect with him because it's been a while. For us, we're saying, hey, we're identifying folks based off of what they're being exposed to. Here's a list of those folks. Now you can connect with them based off of what they might be experiencing. And it's what we call it is actionable intelligence, right? You're
Mhm.
able to identify what's going on within folks, and then provide support based off of that. A lot of what peer support does is just, again, guesswork. They just assume that, if there's an officer involved shooting, everybody within the department knows that, right? That's not news to anyone. But again, these domestic violence calls, these micro traumas, these incidents that build up over time, that's really what we're trying to solve.
And as you point out too, that even peer support, which I'm a huge fan of and have been on my department's team at some point, is reactive. You really have to either wait for the officer to come to you, or you reach out, but it's kind of a crapshoot whether they whether they accept the help or not, or whether they feel like they need the help or not. So the one thing I think anyone listening, any cop who has had any dealings with bad leadership, which of course for us here at the squadron, like the enemy that we are planting our flag against is against bad leadership. And by no means does that mean that all leaders in police organizations are bad. There's thousands of great ones, but a
Right.
lot of our listeners, I think, work for the other kind, and they're thinking to themselves, I don't want my command staff knowing. I mean, conceivably, they could look into any CAD system and know what calls any officer went to, and there are recaps and there are shift briefings, etc. So they could still get this information if they wanted to, but this kind of pools it for them in a very specific point that is easy for them to access. I have to think that um, the type of leadership in a department is very important in terms of getting officers to trust the system. What have you found in that capacity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it really comes down to transparency, right? And I think it's how leadership folks approach it. So, for
Mhm.
example, at the leadership level, or just anyone who's in an administrative folks, they can this data exists, right? We're not recreating any data. We're not doing anything new. All of this exists within your CAD system. So interestingly
Mhm.
enough, and I'm sure you know this, every single agency has a CAD and RMS system, but they're only using it one dimensionally. They're only using it to catalog criminal activity. They're not realizing that this is really telling them something extremely powerful about their folks, right? So we're coming at it from a completely different approach by saying, hey, take a look at this. This is going to tell you something that you need to know and how to support your folks and how to make decisions based off of that data, right? So again, you could do that like at a low level. You could reach out to your IT folks if you're in your agency, or you can say, hey, generate this report for me and send it to me on a weekly basis, daily basis, and again, that's really difficult to manage. The experience isn't very good. And again, if anything, you just have to do more homework, right? Um,
Yeah.
where we're saying, hey, we'll do that integration for you automatically. So again, one of our integration partners is Motorola. The other ones is Sunridge Systems, so RIMS within California. Um, and essentially, we pull that data automatically from those systems, and that'll go into our dashboard, and you'll be able to see that in real time. So um, again, it makes it a lot easier for the agencies to gather that data to identify what's going on within their workforce. But more importantly, like the problem is agencies and leadership folks just don't have the bandwidth to do this, right? They're so focused and spread thin across a wide variety of different things. Wrangling data is not something they want to be in, right? They don't want to be IT folks, right? And for the most part, they don't have technical resources that can help them like navigate these challenges, right? So
Right.
I think at a high level, that's really there's a lot of challenges that we solve within an agency, and you know this goes back to no one ever wants to support the government because again it's not very sexy and it's very sales cycles are really long, and getting anything
Mhm.
implemented you have so much bureaucracy and a lot of stakeholders. And for example, like with Seattle right now, they have labor unions, and they're like, hey, if your dashboard says that this person needs peer support, you're identifying them as someone who should be off the street, and so there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of politics involved with what we do. But at the end of the day, again, what we're doing is not is not anything that you couldn't do now. What we're doing is
Mhm.
something we're just taking a completely different approach to it and just saying, hey, it's a lot easier for you to be able to support your folks. So I think right now, like leadership thinks like it's very, very hard to get a behavioral health specialist like on staff, right? It's super expensive. These contracts, it doesn't make sense for our agency. I'll have to pull resources from somewhere else. Where we're saying, hey, all of that is included within our app at this, rate over the course of a year, and it's confidential, it's secure, it's not just for personnel and leadership folks, it's also for their families as well. So extended family also has access to Mindbase, so they'll get the same benefits, the same resources. Won't be driven proactively for them because they're not going out to any calls, right? But again, they'll be able to identify, you know, there's a level of self-awareness that they'll have to like have in order to use the app, which again I think it just comes down to the experience. If it makes me feel great and good, and this is a journey that I can go through in order to feel better, then that's
Mhm.
fantastic, right?
What you mentioned it, and immediately a light bulb went off in my head. Is we are often our own worst enemy, and
Right.
when we get together, in a collective bargaining unit, we're almost always we're often our own worst enemy. Like I've
Yeah.
seen unions across the country do things that are completely in the worst interests of the employees at times, under the guise of protecting them. How do you get buy-in from a union on something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, um, it's extremely difficult. I think they have to see the value in what we're doing, and unfortunately, it can either make or break, like implementing something like this. I think labor unions see this more as like a liability in some instances, where we're trying to say, hey, um, so for example, I had a call with an agency. I won't say the name, but it's a larger metro agency, just for reference. But they were saying, "Hey, we know that these things happen, but if we know about it and we don't do anything about it, that makes us liable, right? If 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 it happens and we visibility, so we weren't aware, then we can, then we're not liable for like lawsuits. We're not liable for, not doing our job or things along those lines, right? So it, this all circles back to my premise that public safety is fragmented. There's a lot of friction points on how to do things correctly, and really it just comes down to education, right? It's educating the right folks on what we're going to be doing and in what ways. So, for example, one of the biggest frictions points that I get, or one of the biggest pushbacks is how are you going to navigate like requests for disclosures? If people want to subpoena stuff from you, how are you going to navigate that? That's going to make us more liable to, if someone in the city finds out that our officers are using this app, then they're going to want to pull this data, and they're going to want to know, if this officer was involved in a shooting or, in a specific case, then they can pull this data and say, I want to know if he was stressed. I want to know if he was going through any challenges. I want to know that information. But the beautiful thing is we don't capture any of that. So everything is completely anonymous within Mindbase's platform. So we don't actually know what anyone is doing. We just provide the resources in order for you to go through that. But it's not like Starbucks, for example, if when you buy a latte and they know they give you 5 stars because you bought a grande, right? We don't capture any of that behavioral analytics. So that's the other piece to it. So it doesn't. We're not subject to like requests for disclosure or any sort of subpoena request because that information doesn't exist on our side. And when we start like going through that experience for the agency and really working them through kind of what this means and in what ways, they really start to wrap their mind around the idea of, okay, this is actually a really, really good resource for my folks because it's outside of the agency, right? There's a couple of other providers who do similar work to what we're doing. They create public safety apps for law enforcement. Um, but again, it's these apps are more branded toward the agency. So, for example, if I'm at the Seattle Police Department and they're using those resources, it's a Seattle Police Department app. For us, it's Mindbase's app, and the reason behind that is we want it to be a clear disconnect from the agency, right? One of the biggest things that we found early on was when we were doing agency apps, our adoption levels were extremely low, right? People were saying, "Hey, I feel like they're watching me. I feel like they're monitoring me." So we made the clear distinction of having it be specific for Mindbase, right? And having the agency be completely disconnected from that. There's still peer support folks in there from the agency, chaplains, behavioral health specialists, whatever network that the agency has is still plugged into the app. But in terms of them being able to identify, like if you went through a specific exercise or a module, or if you looked at an article or went through a resource, they'll never be able to see that. And when we start painting that picture, then they really get comfortable with the idea of, okay, this is really a unique way to approach it. But again, labor unions is and you're right. I think I don't think it's by default that they don't want ways to support their folks. I think there's so much skepticism
Right.
in
Right.
everything that they do, right? And they just have to look at it that way, right? And I think last time we talked, like you mentioned, like there's a level of cynicism that you have to have when you're an officer and you're going around with a gun on you 24 hours or 7 hours during 12 hours, whatever, how long your shift is. You have to think in these terms, right? You have to think of what's best for me and in what ways can it affect me. So really oftentimes when we meet with like chiefs and leaderships, they approach us from that perspective too. Like they're really resilient, or excuse me, they're really reluctant to implement something like this because they think, they're really reluctant to change. And that's one of my biggest things is finding like progressive leaders who say, hey, I know this is a problem. I need to provide a resource that can help solve these challenges. And again, that will transcend into other areas, right? So
Mhm.
I think this, like community health units is a big thing right now, right? Having like social workers in the field on patrol and things like that, right? That's a big focus area right now. Um, and I met with Chief Harvey over at the FAR Police Department in Texas last week, and he was, he did a session on that, and he invited me up to speak, and we were talking about it, and he was trying to share his experience with other agencies so they could implement a good strategy for community facing resources. And when I told him, I said, hey, what you're sharing here is great, but it really comes down to a couple key things, and it's education, right? I don't think folks really understand how to use law enforcement, right? And I think it's because we've been conditioned a certain way, right? Anything critical that happens, you call 911, right? Anything that's critical to you, right? And for people, that can mean a wide variety of different things, right? So, for example, um, he was telling me about some of the work that his mental wellness unit was doing within the community, and I was telling him, I said, hey, it sounds like your folks are doing a lot of triaging, right? Which isn't your job, and unfortunately, it just comes down to like lack of education. They don't know how to use law enforcement correctly for these specific circumstances. So, for
Sure. Yeah.
example, like um, if you want to have someone do a wellness checkup on your uncle because he has mental health issues, or because your son might be freaking out, and you call 911, right? There needs to be a clear connection of who you need to call, right? And I use the example of, cat in the tree and the fire department shows up. That's animal services job, right? But folks don't know that. They just know this is a really, really serious event for them, and they need to call folks who handle serious events, and that's always law enforcement, right? So and I think that's like the biggest thing is making a clear connection with your community by saying, hey, this is what we do, this is how we help, and in what ways. And I think it goes a lot further than that. But again, I think that's really, I think it comes down to the education piece.
I want to go back to something you said, and I want to make sure I understand you, because if I understood you correctly, it's a really crystal clear example of how far we have to go still. And it was when you talked about the major metropolitan area agency that you didn't name, but that if they knew about these events with their officers, if they knew that their officer was in crisis and was out on the street, and they didn't do something about it, about treating that officer, and then the officer does something, or something happens to the officer, whether it's a excessive use of force or a shooting, or this officer commits suicide, etc., the agency saying, if we know about those things but we didn't do anything about it, we're liable for it. But if
Right.
we cover our eyes to it and we pretend that if we just pretend that it's not there, then we're not liable. Is that it? Am I understanding that correctly? That was the conversation.
Correct.
So that should give any officer pause, any firefighter, any paramedic pause in understanding the mountain we have to climb with this idea, whether it's Mindbase or any sort of personal accountability or agency accountability for the health and wellness of their officers. I mean, that is a monumental mountain to climb when an
Yeah.
agency is going, nope, it's way better if we keep our eyes shut, and if that officer goes out and shoots an innocent person, we'll roll the dice on that. If that officer commits suicide, we're willing to let that family lose their loved one rather than do something about it. I mean, it's disheartening and like I'll be honest, like crushing all at the same time that an agency of any size, but especially a major one. And when you think of metropolitan agencies, you often think of more progressive agencies, like even those that we're still banging our head against the wall with this refusal to understand what your people are going through. I mean, that it just I'm almost speechless, and it's frustrating because you think, at my level, you often think that's what they're thinking, but then you also think, no, I mean, it can't be that. Like, they gotta care, right? And so to hear that, no, they don't. Some of it, I mean, obviously some do. There's a lot of good chiefs out there. There's a lot of
Yeah,
progressive sheriffs out there, like you said. There's people who are trying to promote up so they can change this culture, right? But we still are, for lack of a better term, actually, I think it's the absolutely appropriate term. We're suffering under this archaic idea, this archaic belief of a that we're a, and it just reinforces this belief among many that you're just a line item in the budget. You're not a person, you're not a family member. You're just a badge number, and you're an asset to be used until you can't be used anymore, and then they bring in a new asset, right?
right.
Um, that that has got to be something that has to change. You know.
It's it's funny you say that because it's when after these events happen. So, for example, the agency that I was talking about, the larger metropolitan area one, pays millions of dollars in lawsuits every year, right? And that's to no surprise, right? And interestingly enough, so I met with the Flagstaff Police Department, and they had an officer suicide back in September. And that's when after the fact, that's when they started looking at the data. What was this guy exposed to? What were the events that he was sent out to that might have pushed him to this point? What did we miss? And interestingly enough, that's when they start looking at the data. So um, it's always, how I see it is like, that train that's full of people, and there's like people on top of the train. There's like, because the train's so full, and there's people hanging outside the train, and like
Mhm.
that's how I really see it. It's hanging like on a thread until it breaks, right? And then once it breaks, and you're like, oh shoot, I should have looked at this. I should have, and unfortunately, that's the proactive piece that we're taking. We're saying, hey, here's an alert, or here's a ping, or here's a notification that you're going to get every single time when you need to stay on top of these folks, so you don't have these incidents again. We're never claiming that we're going to solve any of these challenges, but we're going to give you the insight and the data you need to again make more informed decisions on a more prepared force, right? And that's the idea. Is I think right now leaderships and folks don't they just don't know how to support any like mental health and wellness initiatives because that's not their domain, right? If you ask leadership like how they should run or prepare their workforce, then they'll give you some really good insight on that, right? Through their experience. But when you start talking like clinical services or resources from a mental health perspective, that's like a completely different area for them. So that's why they contract out with like these other agencies or like third parties or just don't provide any resources at all because again they just don't understand how to effectively support that. So for us, and I think peer support is a great start. I think peer support really does provide a lot of value. I still think there's some gaps in peer support because again, one of the police departments here in Washington, where I'm at, they're about 40 folks strong, smaller agency. They have two people on their peer support team, and their peer support team isn't very active. And they live the agency is in an area where crime is pretty moderate, and essentially I think what their assumption is, hey, our folks all know each other, right? We're a pretty close knit team. They probably don't feel comfortable talking to, Lieutenant Jackson about anything that's going on. They're not going to disclose that information because they know these guys personally. So they don't want them to think of them differently or know that they're going through any of these challenges. So I think part of that is also like, how do you provide this confidentially? And that's one of the interesting things that we do within Mindbase is so we make peer support multi-jurisdictional. So for example, if I'm at the Seattle Police Department and I am going through some stuff and there's only two or three people on the peer support team and I know those two or three people, I might not feel comfortable talking to them about what I'm going through, but I still need to work through this. And it might not be ripe for psych services or, I might want to rule that out first. So if I want to speak to someone on the agency side, how can I do that? So the idea behind putting it or making peer support multi-jurisdictional is I can connect with anyone who's designated peer support folks at any agency. So again, what that does is two things. It allows you to connect with folks when you need it,
Mhm.
indirectly, but it also broadens the reach and the scope for agencies. So again, some agencies only have 2 or 3 people. That's not very effective if your agency is a lot larger. But now you
Yeah,
have access to this whole network. So we're creating this whole network of peer support folks for agencies to tap into.
I think that's a great idea. It makes sense. In a I'm surprised that big agency has such a small amount, but yeah, you wouldn't necessarily if you know both of them, if they're your barbecue partners, and you
Yeah.
may not want to talk about it, that kind of stuff with them. We were just I was kind of just bashing command there, rightfully so, I think, for those who are in the older space. But you did mention an agency that I think of as rather progressive, which is Flagstaff,
Yeah.
and um, there are others out there, and we don't want to necessarily call out the bad ones in hopes that we can get them to change, behind closed doors. But who are the people that we should be highlighting, or the agencies that we should be highlighting that you see are open to this, are trying to learn this stuff, are very, out there in front of it? Who do we look to as our leaders in this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of agencies that really have it together. And if I were to highlight any, so I think my first one would be like the Aurora, Colorado Police Department. So they
Mm,
have a really, really good wellness unit. Their wellness unit really embraces a lot of progressive outlooks and tries to approach this from a holistic view, right? And I think for them, Colorado has had their fair share of events. I'm sure you know more recently, but just
yeah.
historically, Colorado has been subject to, a lot of trauma. And interestingly enough, they've made wellness and resiliency a priority. So they have a lot of committees within agencies. They have a lot of resources. They also have a really good network uh, between different associations and organizations. So like the Colorado Fallen Hero Foundation really helps folks
Hmm.
from external family members, but also inside internally within agencies as well. So they really have it together in terms of how they provide resources to the folks who need it most, but also to raise awareness to just let everyone know that mental health is a priority for them. And I think that
Yeah.
really is what it comes down to, right? You can tell which agencies are focused on what areas within their department and also within their community. And then you can tell which other ones really have it dialed in terms of not just transparency, awareness, but also providing resources. So I think
It's
Colorado's
interesting
doing
you
great.
it's interesting you pick out Aurora specifically. Their former chief, Nick Metz,
He was a
is
Seattle chief
he's
at one point too.
who was the Seattle chief, right? Who kind
Yeah,
of the circle there for you.
yeah.
Um, he when he retired from Aurora, he started Code 4 counseling
His
with his
wife. Yeah,
wife, and are doing great things there. He's actually coming on the show, so I'm excited to hear you talk about him specifically, because yeah, I think he's an absolute leader in this space. Who else? Give me one or two more that you think are doing something right.
yeah. So I met with the LAPD a while back. I think back in January I met with them, and I met with Dr. Dorian. He oversees their clinical psych services for the LAPD. LAPD is kind of a skewed um, benchmark of where an agency should be, right? They obviously have a lot of resources. They have a really big operating budget. So I
Mhm.
think Dr. Dorian was mentioning that they have, I want to say between 8 to 12 clinicians who are actually out in the field on patrol with folks, right? Not every agency has access to that. So for them, they're really progressive because again they adopted the idea of, hey, we need to have clinical services out in the field early on. So
Mhm.
that's something that they've been doing for a while. So they're really progressive by not just adopting new ways to support their folks, but also embracing these different things like mental health and embracing that not just internally but also externally, right? And I think that's the disconnect with most agencies is they don't make that clear connection, and it might come down
Mhm.
to limited resources, it might come down to funding, it might come down to a wide variety of different things. But in terms of what I've realized is agencies don't really take a peek at what other folks are doing and try to adopt and implement. Because again, a lot of these people, like Aurora and the LAPD, um, I want to say the Seattle Police Department is really progressive, but I think they've had their fair share of events that would make folks think otherwise, right?
Right.
Externally, and you know, Chief Harvey from the FAR Police Department in Texas, he's really progressive. He really wants the community to understand, like, hey, we're supporting our officers, so they can turn around and support you, right?
Hmm.
One of the things that he said that was really interesting is this starts at the individual officer level. That you can't have the expectation that our folks are going to go out and know how to effectively support the community if they're struggling with something themselves, right? At a personal level, that's just really how it is, right? Fundamentally, you can't do that. Um, some people might be a little bit more resilient. Some people might be a little bit more well prepared for these kinds of situations and things. But again, you have to have that fundamental knowledge of how to support and in what ways. So I think the LAPD is doing really interesting things. Um, again, they have a lot more resources than most agencies.
Yeah.
Their psych services program is really good because again they have a lot of clinicians out on the field. But I think those would really be the top three that I would say is Colorado, Texas, and the LAPD.
One of the things too about LAPD that I like, we've had Jay Nagdeman on, who's a part of the BSS at LAPD. What I think is really unique, we all go through a psych exam when you get hired,
Right.
and there's some sort of psychologist either on staff for the larger agencies or contracted out to make sure that you get vetted in the hiring process. But what is really unique to them is they have a whole staff of psychologists who are trained in police psychology as a specialty, because it's actually its own specialty, right? Who are there just for the in-service people, and they're there just they're there. Once you get hired, you're then brought into that group of people who are out there to take care of it. I think that's really neat. And Jay was a great guest on the show talking about like in service, taking care of yourself in service. And I always think of Dr. Kevin Gilmartin's quote about, your warranty on that psych exam when you get hired, that warranty is good for like 5 years. And then you
Yeah.
got to get recertified like a used car, and make sure that you're still good to go. And I would say it's even shorter than that, maybe 3 years. But they do a lot of great work at LAPD in a lot of ways, but really there with that. I'm also curious here, I get like going into tech, and then understanding this is a need in agencies, but I don't think anybody can approach the mindfulness space, the self-awareness space, the self-development space without their own practice. So I'm curious what you do that you use, because you also have a stressful job in terms of running a company.
Yeah.
What are the things you use in your own practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I I I know this is going to sound strange, but I try to meditate every day, right? I try to make
That
it
didn't
part
sound
of,
strange. I think it's great.
it is great, and it's extremely helpful. And
Hmm.
but when I tell anyone about it, they're like, "Really? You wake up at 6:30 every day and you meditate for half an hour?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I do. If I don't, the rest of the day is just like I need that time. I really do,
Hmm.
And when I was commuting every day, down into the office, it was about 45-minute drive. And I always tell my wife, like, I would never turn on the radio. I would never listen to music. I would just like collect myself. Like that was like I wasn't like formally meditating, but that 45 minutes, that half an hour, of my commute into the city
Hmm.
was great. Like I was able to, recap on a lot of different things. I was able to, collect myself and kind of work through not just the action items of what I needed to go through on that daily basis, but I was able to just like reset, like recenter myself, but more importantly, prepare myself for what was ahead, right?
Hmm.
Um, and as a founder, or as just someone who has any responsibility, right? You kind of let like mental health or just like personal care just kind of fall by the wayside, right? And that's one of the things that I've realized is early on is when we were first building Mindbase, it was um, it was interesting because we were struggling with a lot of what we were doing early on, right? Because this was again a new concept, right? So we spent about 9 months, 8 months building the platform, right? Getting the integrations right. I did a ton of ride-alongs with agencies and folks to really understand like how an officer, their day to day, what they go through, how they like use a CAD system. I wanted to know like why they dispositioned it a certain way, because when a call comes in and it's dispatched out, that's not necessarily the case after it's been closed out in a system. So I really wanted to understand like, but more importantly, I wanted to to understand how an officer like goes through these calls and through these sequences, right? Um, like what do you do to like navigate? For me, if I have like a stressful meeting and or if I have like a stressful day, I'll like disconnect and I just I won't like respond to an email for a while or emails for a while, or I just won't answer my phone for like an hour or two, right? Like I'll do something that'll help me through that. If you're an officer and you have a call and you disposition it out and you close it out and you get another one 7 minutes later or 5 minutes later, whatever the time frame is, you don't have time to bounce back from that. You just got to be on. And so that's what I really wanted to understand. Like, what are they doing in that interim time frame to really work through that, if anything at all? And what I
Mm.
was finding was that it wasn't anything, right? Like, you just don't have the time to do that. So I'm not saying I want officers to pop open the app every single time after every call and listen to this session or go through this exercise or do this or do that. I'm saying I want you to know that that's there, because for me, what's there is like meditation in the morning, right? What's there is being able to disconnect from what I've got going on at work, right? Being able to talk to like my wife or like my CTO or somebody else about what's going on with me, what's bothering me. And it's
Mm.
interesting because um, one of the chiefs that I met with was saying, hey, there's a lot of loneliness that goes along with policing, right? And in some instances it's a lot like being a founder, right? Like it's a lonely ride to the top, right? And you're kind of doing that alone. You're kind of navigating like the startup world, and unless you have like a good set of advisors, which we do, you're really kind of left out there to kind of figure it out on your own. And it's a lot like police work. From that regard, I don't necessarily want to make the claim that ours is as stressful as what you guys got going on, but he made the joke that that's why you see officers parked next to each other for like 45 minutes at a time, just like shooting the shit, right? Having a conversation and just talking about anything, right? You see it left and right. You drive by two officers in squad cars and they're parked right next to each other. They're having a conversation. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think um, so. If anything, you know, for me, what's helped is just having access to the right resources. One of the resources that's been really beneficial to me is being able to meditate every morning. I don't necessarily think it's driven by anything other than just wanting to clear my head, wanting to prepare myself for what's next. And I think that's one of the shifts that agencies need to like try to make and understand is by saying, hey, um, we can't set the expectation that you're going to feel good about after every call because you're going to go through this, but you have the option to do it. And if you do it over time, you'll be able to work through that on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's such an easy place to start. As I continue continue to try and integrate a consistent meditation practice.
Yeah.
Um, I'm jealous of the 30 minutes. I can't. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. Uh, Bruce, where can people learn more about Mindbase and learn about you and what you guys are trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so we a couple different ways. Our website's always a good resource, and I always direct folks there. So it's just getmindbase.com, and that will give you a good overview of what we're doing, a little bit about our technology. We also partner with a handful of associations. So we're partnering with the most recently, and I'm really excited about this, the National Police Foundation. So we're going to be doing a session with them, a webinar with them called Mission Ready Minds. And it's really going to be geared towards a lot of the challenges and really how to address like the diminished strength of like your workforce, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot of challenges that are going on, not just from a mental health perspective, but at an agency level, right? So we're bringing on a lot of thought leaders. Mitch Javidi, Dr. Mitch Javidi, who's founder of the National Command and Staff College. He's more on the professional development side. He's actually the technology partner for the National Sheriff's Association. And he's going to be on it, just sharing, how to approach this from a professional development perspective, right? And then also Sergeant Petrucci from the Aurora Police Department is going to be on it as well, just sharing his experience. He's been at the Aurora Police Department for a long time, and he has some really interesting progressive approaches to how to help agencies just work through a lot of the challenges that they've had to work through. They had a real problem with riots, and after a lot of the movements that happened last year, and for them it was one of the things that interests them about us is how can we help officers know that we support them and that we're here for them and that we provide a resource that's going to help them um, at all times. And so it was strange because I've never heard this before from an agency, but they were really transparent about the problems and the pain points that they were having. So when I met with Aurora and their leadership, they're like, hey, last year we had 85 folks that resigned. 85 from an agency. Like their agency is really large. I think they're about 1,300 folks.
Yeah.
But 85 is a hit for any agency, right? And they also mentioned like, hey, we had a fire 19. And, I connect with them regularly, and they were telling me, this year alone, we've had 27 folks that have resigned, right? So for them, one of the biggest things is retention, right? And I think that comes down to, it's one of the most difficult times to be an officer than any other period of time in history, right? 2 years
for
ago,
sure.
3 years ago, if you were an officer, you were a hero. Today, that's not necessarily the case, right? So for us, doing these partnerships, we're structured a lot like a tech company where a lot of where we're structured a lot like a tech company where we like to have these partnerships in place that help us provide the most meaningful value to these agencies. So there's a lot that we don't do. One of the things that agencies always ask us is, hey, who's creating the content for you guys? Like who's doing this? How do we know that's specifically for officers? And we've actually partnered with a handful of clinicians. I think we're at like 9 right now total. So we're really fortunate about that. But essentially these guys are, they have experience like crisis incident stress management and a wide variety of other different things. And they're creating like psychological first aid kits for us. Like they're creating all of this valuable content that we can provide agencies, because again, they struggle with creating this stuff, right? They don't know like how to effectively support their workforce. So for us, it's like, not only are we like doing something really interesting for by integrating into a CAD system and identifying things early on, but we're also like creating this huge extensive library of like resources for agencies to tap into. And we're doing that in partnership with like the National Police Foundation, the National Sheriff's Association, and a wide variety of other different folks that just, we're pulling together all of these like thought leader resources that you can have access to. So if you want to take a peek at that, I'd say one of the best ways to do that is hopping on our website or registering for one of the webinars. We try to do them quarterly with a thought leader like the National Police Foundation or anybody else to really like help the industry understand like, hey, we know that you're having these problems and challenges, and here's these resources that are available.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for being on the show. I think this is a very important topic, a very important issue for us. When we often address the individual officer and what the individual officer can do to improve their mental wellness, their mindfulness, their nutrition, their physical fitness, their leadership, especially. But it's such a massive topic to talk about agencies that I have yet to try and tackle that at that level. So this is my first attempt at doing that, and I appreciate you walking us through what those challenges are like for you. So thanks for your time today, and excited to see where you take Mindbase.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to connecting with folks and sharing more.
All right, thanks for listening to this episode with Bruce Valles, CEO of Mindbase. You can learn more at Get Mindbase, or just check the show notes for all the links there. And real quick before you go, I want to offer you something that I'm very excited about, and it's absolutely free. We've launched Tactical Tuesdays, our free weekly email where we bring you a few tips, tactics, and strategies to help you succeed in the week ahead. It may be about a book I want to share, some gear I found useful, maybe just an inspiring quote or a documentary that I think is really interesting. Anything I think that could help you improve your day, improve your life. To sign up for the Tactical Tuesday list, you can visit thesquadroom.net/Tactical Tuesdays, or just email Just text your name and email address to 805-364-2331. Again, 805-364-2331. If you didn't catch that, we'll include that number in the show notes as well, so you can find it there. All right, everybody. I hope you all have a safe and fantastic week. And until next time, take care of each other and stay safe.